Hi, thanks for joining us in person as well as online. I'm Paul Healy with Sony Electronics. So today we're going to change up a little bit of the format. Instead of kind of going over a technical review of the cameras, we're going to go a little bit more into sort of the industry opportunities to use cinematic production in multiple disciplines, perhaps not just traditional cinema production. So we are going to be focused on things that the Venice camera, Venice 2, and Burano camera has. I'm sorry, I never got the clicker. That was my apologies. Excuse me one moment. Thank you. For those later on, this deck is probably provided. That's my contact info if we need to review it. So as I said, a great basis of our conversation is going to be formed off of what we really developed with the Venice cinema camera and its successes in episodic and feature work. But what about all the projects and maybe even the change of industry direction slightly? How do we address and what do we look for in these other types of productions? So, how is this cinematic look kind of reaching corporations and industrial type of projects or live concert videos? Well, clearly it wasn't just a boardroom decision. It came out of music videos, it came out of gaming, it came out of the feature film influence, and it really just came out of creativity, right? This is our industry moving forward in some new way to have an aesthetic in our project styles. So, where did it all begin was really we started to see, especially during COVID period, we saw Broadway shows and live formats start to reach streaming services. And at that point, they knew they wanted the episodic sort of cinematic look, but applying it to live events and then distributing it to a number of individuals. So here we have just a short section of either concert performance or theater performance videos using the Venice camera. So, but there's also the big Sunday game that covers things with full format sensors and captures the ultra selective depth of field of a player on a sports game or just a follow doc related. We even have cinema cameras making their way into news programming like The Daily Show, where here we have a great environment of build-ups for lens coverage, and we'll talk about how you crew up a project like that differently than perhaps you would a set. But faith, house of worship with sliders, sports games with long box lenses, and Broadway shows are all environments that reach into the expanded use of a cinematic look. Back to when we were entering the first days of COVID, we actually saw Broadway shows that were ready to have audiences in the crowd. Actors are set, everything's done, the stage, everything's prepared, but they don't have an audience. So now we started to see things like The Christmas Carol, produced, I would say, I guess this is 2020, instantly go to how do we pivot and deliver a selective point of view? And you think of theater, it's obviously you see the whole stage at once, but now you had a directorial sort of aspect that changed, and the cameras delivered that selective focus. You also had environments where we were looking at how do you remain near the production without truly being at the production. So now we start to find slightly remote, whether it's completely remote or very far away, or near set environments where you could control the camera, whether it be through fiber connections and fizz controls, all while still giving those aesthetics. So this is an example during the big Sunday game, Super Bowl game. So then, where else are we starting to see cinematic cameras used? Well, virtual production is really a system that uses LED walls, and they're emitting light, right? There are light emitters. So we have to look at different scan modes that could be an advantage, acquisition formats, workflows, how the actual virtual production toolkits plug into the camera. So there's yet another cinematic tool that we're using in perhaps what it was not originally designed to be. Creativity started to lend itself, and then as time went on, the product matures, and the crew does as well. So here's a quick example, and again, online you're probably seeing the neighboring stream, and in person you're going to be looking at the monitor here, but the set involves very little practical in front of the scene. But we're going to want to separate the subject from the background enough that we start to get a shallow depth of field. So if we're just focusing on the car scene that was shot with the Venice at Car Stage in New York, we positioned it probably about 4 feet away from the first window of the car. And now all those interesting elements of the virtual production wall are being captured. And that is largely lens positioning, but also a cinematic camera that was able to operate in full frame format. So a great environment, and to dive into a little bit more, the benefits of a cinema camera capture the fidelity, the color fidelity that LED wall emits, because there's obviously light spectrum. So we're taking advantage of cinematic cameras for also what it could capture as far as emissive lights. So I mentioned live news shows. Let's look at this environment here. Here we have a camera that is not that unfamiliar to a studio broadcast 2/3 inch. We'll talk more about what 2/3 inch is, but 2/3 inch broadcast studio system. There's a teleprompter on the front. There's a fiber cable sticking off the back that goes to a control room. There's a pedestal that people could rise up and drop down as they need for certain shot structures. But in the middle is a cinematic camera with cinematic color fidelity and cinematic sensor modes. And included in that, in this case, is actually cinematic glass, which makes a big difference, right? So we're not using a long focal length of, okay, this lens has a 22 zoom, 22, 186 times zoom. We're talking about something that has about a 4-6 times zoom ratio. So the crews that come with this kind of production actually come from set. In this environment, it's a job for a DIT to actually still be working on this type of live news show that ends up delivering the proper camera settings for safe dynamic range. It's the camera assistant that's very used to working with camera menus of a cinema camera versus the culture of typically being the control room making the decision. So here we have a real mashup of the culture of broadcast and the operators from cinematic production. So this would be like, if we had a cheat sheet to come back to later, it would really be, what are the hurdles that we're going to find? You know, focus control, right? I mean, this is shallow depth of field versus broadcast cameras. There's a lot shallower of focus. Is there a concern that video game look is too much for or any look for that matter? Am I going too far? Is it delivering what I want? How do I paint the camera? How do I control it with a LUT? And on, you know, through to the idea of who's going to control it and will it sort of fall into my existing workflow that I have for the other camera positions. So how do we achieve that in our lineup? Well, it's unique. We're kind of in a spot, Sony's in a unique spot where our cinema lineup includes, you know, Venice cameras, FX6, FX3, FR7, robotic cameras. So we have almost a product for each one, and we're going to go over some of the applications to achieve that cinematic look with certain tools. But at the core of them, they are all full frame format. And I'm going to spend a minute on this because, you know, when we talk to major Hollywood cinematographers, they talk about the color of the camera. They talk about the fact that log space is important to them. And that has translated into all these other corporate videos, industrials, and everything else. Not everybody is as articulate as figuring out why they have that emotional feeling to it. But in this case, it's Paul Cameron, ASC. He's very articulate as to what his vision statement is. And so, of course, we have his quote here. So let's just take a second. If you're not familiar with full frame versus Super 35, what are our benefits? Okay, a shallower depth of field, selectable, right? Now, this is what we said with the Broadway shows. We think, hey, how can we actually separate the subject of focus while we're not in person, right? So now we're going to tell the story by selecting who we want the subject to be focused on. End zone, big touchdown, right? Somebody is going to be the selective subject of that shot, and everything else just becomes a blur, right? The next thing would be selectively, by the way. This isn't to be used every single shot everywhere. The next thing would be our world is moving into anamorphic look for various types of, not just car commercials, not just feature, not just, so really we want to make sure that we could cover all types of lenses. And then the very last point that I had in the sort of sensor development is actually about Ks. And I just want to point out, so We need to be capable of doing 2K, 6K, 8K, not because of necessarily the Ks themselves, but when we go into different scan modes, and I'll explain that. Just aesthetically, if you look at a Super 35 sensor, it's going to be placed inside a full format sensor. And so if we were saying that we started with a 2K sensor overall, just to be fair, let's say the blue sensor on the top, the whole thing is 2K. But then we need to crop into a Super 35. We're now at and I don't do the math right here, but let's just say we're at a 1.6K sensor. So we need to start at higher Ks to be able to deliver all of the different formats of lens coverage and creative tools. So that's why the Ks matter to cinematic production in all genres. The other thing that comes in is we're talking about cinema cameras applying for different segments, all different types of genres. So think about the documentary world. Think about sort of the close contestant-based shows, right? We are in constraint areas. We have 2 shots. We have 3 shots that we need to cover, but yet it's a really tight space. Super 35 is a narrower lens than full frame. And when I talk about that, it looks something like this. Full frame is going to give you a wider angle of view available when you have that lens coverage. So I could achieve either a vista in this case, or just the ability to have multiple people in the shot where all I do is treat it as a full frame coverage or a Super 35. It's also something I could use as a doubler for those production environments where I don't have a really long zoom lens. This is going to act as, perhaps not a double, but a multiplier to allow you to treat it as more telephoto. And just visually, when we went over the idea of lens coverage, this is kind of like you start at 8K and you start to crop in, and yet you still deliver at least a 4K image. Staying on the sensor side again, before we go back to production, is dynamic range. So more and more often, I'm going to go back to the Broadway reference, right? So we got curtain shots, we have curtain shots, we have shadowy areas, we have heavily lit sporting stadiums, we have all these environments are high contrast, and yes, we can manage that by eye. We're very good about it. I mean, sometimes if you watch, a game where the field is half illuminated, studio cameras, broadcast studio cameras, have a gate that they could adjust for covering those 2 very diverse areas. Well, here we get 16 stops of dynamic range in a cinema camera. So when you look for typically clipped highlights, here you're going to have what I would refer to as a thicker negative, right? You're going to have the range to show the shadowy details and to protect those highlights, unlike in some of the other attributes. When we do that, and I won't make you read this entire slide, it's really busy, but the point and premise here is the more light that you're bringing in, the more dynamic range. Let's just remember that you also want color accurate expansion into 709 and beyond, and that's what cinematic cameras also offer. I'll come back to this later if people have questions individually. So how do we achieve, if we're saying 15 stops of dynamic range and more color that we could use for these type of productions, but we're hitting a mobile truck, or we're going to hit, even like today's stream, for example. Let's say that we were just reaching a bunch of, computer viewers that were looking at 709 video. What do? Well, we manage it with a LUT. And it may not be the most popular phrase, but sometimes I call a LUT a lie, right? The LUT is a lie. It's not the exact interpretation of everything that is in your log image, but it's an interpretation that you need to have to make a decision, and one that you may even use for distribution. So we start to use LUTs in the way not just for on-set monitoring, but when we're in multi-camera cinema or these other environments for delivery formats. So a LUT is a powerful tool that goes beyond just the set decision. In case anybody needs more depth of LUT, just also add lookup table. Just in case you're not familiar with LUTs, it's lookup table, and you can find out more about that. Okay, so coming into a wrap of the very technical slides, what I need your help on here is understanding 10-bit video versus 16-bit video, because this is all really, really related to what we just went over in the last few slides. In the current slide about 10-bit video format, we're just going to look at how pixelated the red, green, blue parade is. That's representing the highlights. That's the only thing. Won't have to dive into anything more than that. Now let's look at what 16-bit version of this is. Look how granular, how much more. Remember that I said during that quick slide of the color triangle? You have to fill in more color into the area. Well, that's exactly what shooting in a format and recording in XOCN allows us to do. It allows us, raw recording allows us to have the more granularity to our color and to our luminance. So those two have to be tied. Once again, this is a cinema tool that's very commonplace, and it's another reason that broadcast and industrial and other types of productions are adopting it, right? Less ideal environments, more color accurate image for, you know, a red soda can or whatever color is the accurate color. You want it accurate, and you want to make sure you have that there. The last tool is a producer's tool. This is a comment because I just told you to record raw, right? Like, how many people got intimidated by, oh my goodness, we're shooting this industrial video and you just told me to shoot raw. Okay, I get that. But what if we actually start to look at the minutes of recording? Because this is the real equation, right? If I was to, and I'm just going to create some bars here for you so to see. So based on where you're sitting in the room, you may not see the full numeric values. So all I'm going to use is the bar graph on top. The very top pink or red bar that you're seeing is about 400 megabits. It's about 400 megabits. That's 10-bit video recording. That's log video. That's what we do to deliver to a news magazine or whatever we do. We always just deliver 10-bit video. Down at the very bottom is these, you know, cinematic popular ProRes 4x4 12-bit. Now mind you, I just went from 10-bit to 12-bit, but the last slide said 16-bit. So what's the one right below the maroon line or pink line? Is 16-bit raw video recording in Sony's format of XOCN LT. The data rate is almost equal to that of a video codec, and it's about a third of the data size that we would use for ProRes recording. The intimidation factor we've had around RAW, especially in these other delivery formats that are not narrative projects, has been so strong. But in reality, we're creating efficiencies for producer side of things, for workflows, by using, and I say we, I mean a community. I mean Sony manufactured it, but as a community, we want to offer the ability to shoot RAW, protect all of these things, and still give them reasonable card volumes, DITs, some rest at the end of the day, or media managers, so that they're not there not even wasting, it's never a waste, a lot of use of their time doing transfers. We'll even record a proxy so that none of this has to be a big concern. So let's kind of transition into what the products look like. So we've had a long history at Sony, which are 2/3 inch cameras, and they go into, you know, a studio controller, a CCU. We even did this with some cinema cameras like the F55 and the 65. There are competitor products that kind of did a similar thing and adapted, but we really kind of coined the parallel between the two. We really had both sides of it. If you want to do 2/3 inch, we do this. So let's just get a little visual of what we're talking about for creativity. You could see that 2/3 inch sensor versus a full frame sensor, and all those attributes that we said about light sensitivity and all those other things just come into play. It's a larger sensor for a lot of reasons, and some of that equals shallow depth of field, but some of that equals the other things we covered today. But what does it look like? Remember, I just went over that environment with the broadcast studio system. It was for the Daily Show. Here's a build where we have a box lens. This could easily be your favorite baseball game or anything else, or a concert from the rear of the room, or a special event, whatever it is in that way, using the Venice camera, using a studio viewfinder on top, giving the operator that is so used to previously just using a 2/3 inch camera system, a studio camera system, all the tools that they basically don't feel any difference. There's no heavy lift. This is cinema production for everyone, for every type of production. So let's go back to the mobile truck environment. Let's say you're working on a project. It's not, even if it's a fly pack. So you build the fly pack and somebody wants to paint the camera system. That's typically done with a product called an RCP, remote control panel. And they have little buttons for each thing, right? Knobs for everything, but the primary ones are for color balancing. Now, in cinematic world, what do we use? we use a software called LiveGrade. And if you kind of see on this gentleman's laptop here, you'll see he has red, green, blue wheels that he could adjust. He could also adjust gamma and all of those things. So it's interesting because you think about where people expected to use RCPs, they're now using the narrative project tools like LiveGrade instead. So that's the transition we're starting to see in what people use. They'll also use things like autofocus. We have this on demonstration in the other room, so I won't dive into it too much. We'll use ND. So as I start to play through this video, I just want you to get a quick idea of how you could apply ND, variable ND, to various types of productions. So with this video, you might have seen that the flowers never fell out of focus. And yes, we're completely dark now, so we kind of passed the video up. But as we return back, picture this was somebody exiting out of a dark tunnel and onto the bright field. I don't need to drop in an ND filter, which typically would engage, if I have the variable ND in, you wouldn't need to necessarily drop in a filter to then compensate. When that happens, a live production would often cut away, right? They'd say, okay, can't take it, and drop in filter, cut back to them. Here, by leaving a variable ND filter in place, we could adjust as if it was an iris pull, as if it was an auto iris. But as we saw those flowers, it didn't fall out of focus. It stayed the same depth of field the whole time. So creative decisions from a cinematic approach entering into a broadcast environment. Very unique. We also start to see the rise of gimbals. Everybody in this room probably has had a project where you use a gimbal, right? And maybe there's a little setup time, maybe there's some balance, and it's worth it. I won't say that, a gimbal shot is a substitute for anything else. But what about if you're doing college sports and there is a bleacher vibration on the top crow's nest area and it just oscillates, right? Let's say you're doing a concert, or even if it's like faith-based and it's a worship, and there's a band performing and you're by the subwoofer, you put the camera on a hi-hat and you just get this shaking. Well, it's going to translate into the shot and you really struggle for those environments. The new image stabilizations, I'll say, at least in our product line and the Sony lineup, have magnetic sensors, essentially keeping the sensor floating so that it's not just a digital zoom and then moving around on pixels. These are actually sensors that are able to give you what we just saw in that little animation for a moment, a shot that's going to give you a freedom of not working with perhaps a longer lens or be able to have a lot more freedom. And this is another tool that we haven't seen in anything other than cinematic cameras. So that's why they're making their way into other types of projects. Creativity-wise, classic drum set environment. What used to go into the drum set area, the equivalent of I'll call it an action cam just to stay brand generic, but it was just always some sort of product that just kind of lived on the drum set, and that was the shot. And yes, it looked softer. It didn't look as good as the other primary cameras. Well, what if we could take the sensor out of our cinema cameras, put it into a lightweight cavity that just mounts just the sensor in those environments? That's what we did with the Venice Rialto system, and it's opened up tons of creativity. While this environment is for a narrative project, this was for Top Gun, think about the government and other environments, not government as a whole, but I mean government entities using test equipment or proving out a marketing video, whatever they need to do where they're using fighter jets. Same environment. Here we have putting 4 cameras into an array on a fighter jet for Top Gun, but what's the difference that and an aviation company? These are corporate videos that could be done, right? So Rialto has offered a lot of creativity in that way as well. Everybody probably watches their favorite cooking show on, whatever competition show. We find some way, we root for them. Well, in this case, this is one of those baking shows. So, it immediately makes you hungry afterwards, right? So this show I was watching, and I got to meet the producers, and they wanted to try something new for the look. So they mounted PTZ cameras on the ceiling, pan, zoom, tilt cameras. And they were traditionally like 22 zoom, ratio, and they were far back from the room and everything, and they weren't getting the shot structures that they necessarily wanted. They weren't cinematic. But all of their shoulder mount and cameras around the room were actually cinematic cameras. They were usually FX9s. So now they felt like there was a difference between the two looks. They introduced the FR7, which happens to be the only PTZ camera like this, but this is a full frame camera system that you can mount right into the rigging and get the shots that they couldn't get before. So a really unique environment to do a contestant-based show while matching the primary cameras as well as this position. We also see it in other environments where you could place it into a subway set like this, super small area, almost in this case, everybody on the train here were non-professionals in a sense. And so, of course, they didn't have the intimidation factor of like somebody standing with, 3 foot of camera space around them. This was actually a super compact area. They were super comfortable moving around the space as if, they were just under surveillance cameras. They didn't even pick up on it, sort of. Okay, so the main thing that we were trying to cover is, do we have the tools to, cover focus? Yes, we could give the operators the same tools, whether it's the crew from a cinematic production or the crew from like a sporting production environment. Will it look like a video game in the end? Is what we're chasing after the creative tool that somebody said, well, I saw this and I really want that look? Well, maybe what we do want is the video game look. Do we need a LUT? I'm not sure. I mean, we said some people use RCPs, some people use a lookup table, and some people use live grade. So the answer is pretty wide on that one. Can we shade a camera? Yes, RCPs could be shaded just like you would your other trucks and other cameras in a mobile truck. Really unique. So ultimately, I think when we look at whether cinematic cameras match broadcast environments, we are absolutely there. And broadcast cameras can also start to be pulled into, for a purpose, into a cinematic production. So we have this cross-pollination, and ultimately, this is only a very tip of the iceberg that you could research on this. So if you go to Sony Cine, there's a ton of stories that start to talk about whether it's, this past year's Super Bowl or a number of projects. I really encourage you guys to, test what I said today, find out more, and really find the work that we're, chasing after in this ever-changing market, so that really you could be invigorated with taking the aesthetics that you love, that you work with so much, and starting to apply them to the current landscape of cinematic users. So again, thanks for your time. We'll be over in the separate area for demonstrations with our cameras. Thank you all.
Live stream sponsor, Sigma, and we're here with Steph, and she has some cool Sigma cameras.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people that aren't aware that we also sell cameras. It's not what we're known for. We really primarily focus on lenses, Sony lenses, but our founder, his goal was to be like a Canon or a Nikon, so we have cameras. And most recently, yes, they're actually really easy to hold. Right? They have a little finger grip, and it's textured on the front, so
it's got a cool little like styling. I mean, like it's definitely like a modern. It's fun.
It's fun. It's very sleek. It's very trimmed down. It's distraction free. That was the point. So this is the Sigma BF. BF stands for Beautiful Foolishness. Best friend. It's totally best friend.
I'm sorry. What was beautiful?
Beautiful Foolishness.
Okay.
So it's an homage to Japanese tea ceremonies.
Okay.
Just really fun. Very distraction free. When I am photographing for work, I get really distracted with all the settings, and just sometimes it's not enjoyable. So for me to be able to photograph in fun, I want it to be as simple and straightforward as possible. And that is this camera for me now.
No, it's so true, because when I travel, I mean, it's like I want to take great pictures. the iPhone doesn't deliver like what I really want to do, but I also don't want something that's just too encumbersome that I have to think too much about it. So I'm excited to try this and see where it goes.
Well, and it is capable of being shot fully manually, so if you want more control, you totally can do that. But really the point of it is just to kind of step back and focus on composition and creativity.
And I do think of myself as a beautiful fool.
We're all beautiful fools in this world.
You're a beautiful fool. Hey, talking here with our Sigma rep and our live stream sponsor, Steph, over here at Sigma. We're here till 7 p.m. at the OHD 2025 Gear Show. Hope you can come out and see us.